So today I'm going to do just the very beginning of emotional behaviors, and then on Monday we'll go through the brain regions involved in emotion that we know about and do a short review. These quotes to me were the best way to start talking about emotion, since we spent about 2.5 class periods at the beginning of the semester discussing what we think consciousness is, discussing other researchers and philosophers and people's definitions of consciousness, and realizing that nobody agrees on what this is. There's no definition where everybody's going to go in and say, yes, this is what consciousness is. And if you know your psychology history, you know that William James opened the first psychology lab ever in America. And he also has he has the first book that came out for kind of introductory psychology textbook. And he's quoted as saying, "We know the meaning of consciousness as long as no one asks us to define it." Okay, and then I have here quoted Joseph Ledoux, who is a pretty preeminent neuropsychologist currently, who works with young people who are handling neuropsychological problems, but particularly if they are creating emotional issues for those people. So he has a book talking about ADHD, and he is quoted as saying, "Unfortunately, one of the most significant things ever said about emotion may be that everyone knows what it is until they are asked to define it." So we're going to talk about another one of these really quite nebulous areas of psychology where we might not even agree what the definition is. I'm so used to doing some things in a particular way that I like to leave them, and I also like to leave my green questions, even though I don't have a class to talk to directly that can provide any kinds of answers. But I'm doing it anyway because I am going to suggest, as I will keep doing, I'm going to suggest that you pause, think about the answer before listening to me babble on about the answer, because it really is important that you're becoming curious, getting engaged, and thinking through some of these questions, so that when I discuss answers, they can make sense to you, and or you can think, oh, that's not the way I was thinking about it, or I really think differently, because I think it's important for us all to understand what we believe and think, more so than just getting new facts and new information. And these aren't facts, these are thought questions. So we're going to suppose that we've discovered a new species, okay? And we're doing some studies or little tests with this species. And so one of the things we do is we have a green card that has food behind it and a red card that does not have food behind it. The new species always goes to the green card. What can we say about this new species? So pause. We might guess that at the very least, the species has some kind of ability to learn and remember, right? And that it has this experience called hunger and it wants food. Okay, so now we're going to do another little test with our species. The green card has food behind it, and we have various shades of gray cards that do not have food behind them, and the new species still, it always goes to the green card. What can we say about this new species? Pause. Okay, we can say the same thing before. It has memory, it can learn, it has hunger, and now because we have these various shades of gray cards, we've really made sure that it's not just seeing variations in brightness, but that it can see or perceive color. All right, here's the last one. We have a blue triangle card, and it's very hot. A new species touches the triangle card and makes a loud noise and moves away. Someone picks up the blue triangle card with gloves on and moves it towards the species. And the new species makes the same loud noise and moves away rapidly. Now what can we say about this species? Okay, our temptation is to say the species experiences pain, the species experiences fear, and that these are reactions of a species that is experiencing these emotions and these perceptions. Now, what if I tell you that the new species is a robot? Okay, so you're thinking through all of this. The first two make a lot of sense, and the last one you think, why would a robot move away from something very hot? Why would it make a loud noise and move away? And one of the things your author suggests here is that we are very uncomfortable giving artificial life forms this kind of feelings of emotion. And we're going to change our answer a bit, most likely, if we find out that this species is a robot. And one of the points this makes very nicely is we see the species makes a loud noise and moves away. And what we're doing is we're interpreting that, right? We're interpreting that as the experience of pain and the experience of fear. But all we might know is, I mean, if we think it's a robot, we might say, well, the robot has an awareness of when it might be damaged, and it makes a loud noise and moves away. Maybe to scare something else off. The whole point of all of this is this making a loud noise and moving away, that appears to be an emotional behavior. And what we can see is emotional behaviors. And then we go and interpret that and make some assumptions about emotion itself. We assume other people are having similar emotions as us and behave similarly as we do. And so we're kind of making this interpretation of emotions that is not really clear that those people or that robot or that species is actually having the same emotion. So the very first thing we want to do in some manner, even though it's not going to make us all happy, is to distinguish between emotions and emotional behavior. There are two major components of emotion. So the physical component and the feeling component. The physical component, we might see a rapid heart rate, we might see someone start breathing harder, we might see some galvanic skin response difference. We can measure physical measures of emotion. The other component, the feeling, whether someone is feeling scared or happy or excited or nervous, those are feelings and they are unobservable. So we are making some assumptions about people's feelings unless we're directly asking them. And to some extent, I'm going to continue to argue that even as we are interpreting our own physiological response and our own experience, we are interpreting to some extent our own feelings, and where that interpretation comes in is kind of the question. I have here to the right the circumplex model that's included, where we see in the vertical we're talking about how aroused someone is. Are they neutral, aroused, or not aroused? Not aroused at the bottom. And then from the left to right, we're talking about somebody's valence. Okay, so just their mood. Is it negative, neutral, or positive, moving from left to right? And if you see, so if I'm going to say that I like the difference, one difference I like to talk about is nervous versus excited. So I'm pretty aroused, and I could interpret that. It could be I'm aroused because I'm nervous. It could be that I'm aroused because I'm excited. And really my interpretation of that arousal is going to be, to some extent, dependent on not just what's happening with me, but partly on my mood, right, and my overall valence. And so if I'm not very happy about what I'm doing and and I'm aroused, I might experience this as nervousness. But if I'm pretty happy about what I'm doing, and I'm using the word happy even though I don't like using that word necessarily, because I want to say if I'm pretty excited about what I'm doing, but I'm using the same word. But if I'm pretty happy about what I'm doing, or I have a pretty positive valence about what I'm doing, and I'm pretty aroused, I might interpret that as being excited about what I'm doing. And so that's a really different interpretation of a very similar physiological response, and it really depends on valence. If we go towards the down into some of the really feeling not aroused, if I take the same the same levels here, if I'm not very aroused and I'm in a pretty negative mood or negative valence, I might feel pretty depressed. But if I'm really not aroused and I'm in a pretty positive mood or valence, I might consider that or interpret that as being just feeling pretty serene, which is a pretty nice feeling. So we're going to walk through a number of theories of what's happening with this physiological component of emotion. And the common sense kind of way to think about this is, so I see something that's threatening, like a grizzly bear. I feel a sense of fear, and so I have my heart starts pounding, I'm trembling, sweating, and running away. What William James and Carl Lange, so William James, the psychologist, and Carl Lange, a physiologist, back in the late 1800s, suggested was actually our common sense of feeling of how this occurs is backwards. That what we're doing instead is we're perceiving the stimulus, this scary, threatening grizzly bear. We're having some autonomic nervous system arousal or the physiological response. My heart's pounding, I'm trembling and sweating, I'm running away, and that is leading us to the emotion or the feeling of fear. Another theory of how this works comes from Walter Cannon and Philip Bard, and they suggested that the mind and body are experiencing emotion independently and that this is happening simultaneously, such that our autonomic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system, the arousal is happening, that's occurring at the same time and simultaneously with when the brain, with the cortex, is experiencing the experience of the emotion. Okay, so I see the threatening grizzly bear, and at the same time that happens, my heart starts pounding, I'm trembling, sweating, and running away. At the same time, simultaneously, I'm feeling a sense of fear. And finally, almost 100 years later, so more around the 1960s, Stanley Schachter and Jeremy Singer came up with their two-factor theory of emotion, where we're having a physiological response, and depending on the situation we are in, we're going to have a cognitive interpretation, or what we call an emotional label, and we then feel emotion. So just to distinguish the James Lange theory, we have a physiological response, and then we have some kind of interpretation of that response to feel the emotion. In this case, what they're adding is really this cognitive component, and that we are labeling the physiological response before having the actual emotion. So we have an extra block in there of cognitive labeling. So we see the grizzly bear, or whatever threatening stimulus, we have that physiological autonomic nervous system response and arousal. We have the cognitive label, that is one scary bear, I'm afraid of it, and then we feel the emotion of fear. And this slide just shows a nice summary of all of that in one picture from one of my Psych 101 textbooks. And if you find it helpful, great. If not, move on. Walter Cannon was actually the first person to realize and put together that the sympathetic nervous system is a entire system preparing the body for brief, vigorous fight or flight kind of responses. He had this realization of, hey, when my heart starts pounding and I also start sweating and I also start breathing harder and taking in more oxygen, and those feelings all come together, and it appears to be preparing me for a potential fight or flight experience. But and we saw, and your author here gives the picture again of our sympathetic nervous system, where we have the chain of ganglia, and that those neurons are all kind of linked together and close together, so that they can all be getting information at the same time in this fight or flight response. But actually, different situations can evoke a mixture of the sympathetic arousal and the parasympathetic arousal. He gives us just one example of nausea, so that's associated with the sympathetic nervous system and its stimulation of the stomach. But the parasympathetic nervous system is stimulating the intestines and the sweat glands in that case. So it's not necessarily, even though what we want to do in a fight or flight situation is to be prepared to move quickly and react quickly. We also have these mechanisms can be working at the same time as the parasympathetic nervous system in different situations.